To understand the earliest philosophy and the origins of philosophy in ancient Greece, we have to understand things like the world is full of gods and what this could possibly mean. And I think this means that we have to take polytheism seriously, and we have to figure out how to understand polytheism in a way that makes it less like something on the philosophical buffet where you've got these gods and you can kind of just, choose to believe in this or that or the other, which is oftentimes the approach that we take to religion today. But it's important that we don't transplant those values and that approach to ancient Greece or to traditional societies generally. So polytheism comprises something of the worldview of those people. It was how they saw the world and understood themselves and understood the world. It was the mechanism by which they were able to see and able to think about the world in general. And so I think that gives us a little deeper point of entry to understand why it is that it's so inscrutably different and difficult for us to get in the mind of someone like that, because we are already in our own minds. We are already in our own imaginative horizons, and so it's hard to enter into the horizon of someone else. And so in the same spirit, it's important for us to understand that religion and philosophy, religion and society, and indeed religion and anything in the lives of those in ancient Greece and in traditional societies generally, those things were not separate. Religion was not something that you just did one day a week and you kind of compartmentalized it in your life. No. Religion was something that you experienced everywhere all the time. It was not something that was relegated to one particular portion of your life that could actually be separated from everything else that you were doing. And I think there are a handful of dichotomies that will help us to be able to see and gain some kind of entry into understanding what's going on there. And I want to borrow some of this from Mircea Eliade. And so beginning with the dichotomy of the sacred and the profane. And so the sacred and the profane, so you have a sacred world, you have a profane world. You have a spiritual world, you have a mundane world. You have the eternal, you have the corporeal. Well, now we're getting closer to how it is that Eliade conceptualized this and how it is that we might understand traditional societies and ancient polytheism. And that is specifically in this way. Sacred and profane is like universal and particular. And so that, I think, gives us a nice segue in between the ancient societies, the traditional polytheists who were living in the sacred space and entering in and out of the sacred space all the time, insofar as they participated in universality, the world of the archetypes and the eternal, and then went back and forth between the world of the archetypes and the world of their individual lives. That's the kind of thing that we should have in mind here. In other words, you notice that I did not use the terms natural and supernatural. The difference between the sacred and the profane is not the same as the difference between the natural and the supernatural. That's the way that we tend to think about things, that you have a natural world, and there's this hard line that separates nature from what is supernatural, what is divine, because we tend to think of the divine as something that is separate from nature, a God that is in some way hidden from nature. In other words, the Deus absconditus. So this is the concept where God is transcendent. It is beyond nature, entirely beyond potentially even understanding, which is what we get to in the late medieval world. But we only got that far by pushing in that direction for a really long time. That's not the case with ancient polytheism. It's not the case that they separated natural from supernatural. In fact, one is better off, I think, trying to understand ancient polytheism simply by saying it was all just nature. It was all just life. God was just being, and the gods were just there. They were a part of the natural world, a part of your life, what we would regard as our interior life and our exterior lives. So the gods were very much a part of those, crossing over all the time, and indeed there wasn't even really much of a boundary for the ancient polytheists in this way. The metaphor that I like from this comes from environmental philosophy, and that is there is a low fence between self and world for the medieval people. In other words, for those who had the last vestiges of the worldview of divine providence, where we did have a worldview that was based upon and grew from religion, rather than a worldview that could choose from a buffet of religions, where you had individual first and then religion later. In the world of divine providence, in the medieval world, And certainly in the world of the earliest polytheists, you had religion first and then the individual later. And so the individual concept, the way that they understood themselves, was as a kind of thing that emerged from the reality, the deeper reality. And the deeper reality was what was eternal. That was the realm of the sacred, the realm of what would become for Plato the forms, and what Eliade calls in illo tempora, which means in that time, in sacred time, in mythological space and time. And so the idea for the ancient polytheists was to live as much as possible in the eternal, in the archetypal, in the sacred. So, in other words, in the universal. And for Plato, this is going to sound a little bit more familiar to us, where we hear about the universal in terms of mathematics. Mathematics is the paragon. That is the example, the entry point for us to try and understand what the eternal is, and then to move on from there for the forms of all of the different things. But the form of a horse, oftentimes one of the examples that we choose, right? Which is unfortunate because we don't typically think of a god of horses. But the form of horse is such that this is the archetype of horse. It's not any individual horse. Any individual horse is a manifestation of the form, of the archetype. And so the archetypes are eternal and they are not mutable. They are not the sort of thing that lives and dies. They're not ephemeral or corporeal. They are instantiated in all of those corporeal things insofar as those individual things participate in what is eternal. But if we move on from horses and we go over to things like, for instance, memory and sleep, and any number of other things, and human emotions and experiences, and childbirth and anger and war. Now, all of a sudden, when we talk about forms, it sounds an awful lot we're talking about the gods. And indeed, the names that they gave their gods were oftentimes just the names of common words. And so, mnemosony was simply memory. Hypnos was simply sleep. And so we don't often translate the names of the Greek gods, and I mean, mnemosony is a beautiful word, so I kind of understand that. But at the same time, it creates this veil. It makes it to where we can't really see what it was that was going on. And so when they talked about their memory of something, they were using the word mnemosony, and it was for the god of, and in this case, the goddess, so of memory. And so the gods were understood in a way of inside, outside, all the time, entering us, leaving us. We were always involved with the divine world. And so this is where Paul Vane had a book a number of years ago called Did the Greeks Believe in Their Gods? And this is a contemporary question for us that would not have been a question for them. And so for ancient polytheists, not believing in the gods, I mean, what would that even mean? That you don't believe in love? You don't believe in memory? You don't believe in sleep? Okay, I mean, that's crazy, right? And in the same way, in the first millennium, after the time of Christ, people were saying in Christianity, well, okay, there's no doubt in God because God is being itself. If you're seriously saying that you doubt being, then I have other concerns about you, And so that's the kind of thing that was going on in ancient polytheism, where there wasn't a question of like you could choose which gods to believe in, or maybe you had to rationally assent to something. No. This is just part of how the world was made up. And so the thought experiment that I like to propose to students here is to try and imagine how you would describe the world, how you would begin to think about the world if you were just kind of thrown in, with a nod to Heidegger, if you were just kind of thrown in to an ancient polytheistic world where you knew nothing of science, you knew nothing of anything, and all of a sudden you had to survive and you had all these things impinging upon you in terms of hunger and satiety and food and drink and people and society and the clouds and the lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And you had to make sense of the whole thing. What would you do? How would you construct a language? How would you construct even a thought in that context from nothing? And it's hard for us, admittedly, and the answers, of course, are going to be, well, still sort of in our own modern imagination, and so we're going to import some of our values without thinking about it. But at the same time, the whole purpose of that thought experiment is to push us in the direction of thinking that, okay, well, outside of the prejudices, the thoughts that I have with respect to what science should be, what knowledge should be, and what's possible in the world, what do you do? How do you describe the world? How do you speak? How do you think? How do you get along? And what I propose to you is that, well, we're going to talk about what matters. Okay, well, how do we recognize what matters? Well, I mean, things that are going to eat me matter, and things that I can eat matter. And so we're going to pay special attention to those. And so corn seems to be one of those things that's really good. So that's going to be important. And that's going to become, for instance, Persephone. So, the goddess. And then hunger is going to be important, sleep is going to be important, getting together, marriage is going to be, all these different aspects of human culture and getting along in society with other animals and people and all of the accoutrements of living. Those are the aspects that tend to take on a divine persona because those are forces in the world. They are things that recognizably matter in the world. And I think to separate, okay, here is love, and that seems to be distinct from a force of anger and war. And so, well, maybe not, but that's the sort of thing that because we recognize something, it's very easy for that to be elevated to the status not only of a concept and a word, an idea, this is the ancient Greek word, but a God. And so it's very easy for us to anthropomorphize things. It's very easy for us to ascribe agency to things and to tell stories about different aspects of the world as if they were individual personalities. And this is not to say that, oh, that's the origin of the gods and there's, no. This is one possible take on it, but what I'm trying to give you is an entry point into understanding how it is that someone might think about the gods as we think about parts of our mind. So I think about, memory, and I think about all the different pieces of my cognition as being somehow mine. But that's not the way that they thought about it. These things were common, and they were powers, forces in the world. They were things that gave motion and energy somehow to the world, and we experienced them. Whether it was inside or outside, they weren't as concerned about that as we have become. And so that's where you get a world of gods. A world that is full of gods is one that is full of forces. It is full of energy, and it is full of all of these things that in one way or another matter in terms of the way that we can comprehend and get along with the world. And for us to anthropomorphize those things, well, that's just very natural. That's not a problem necessarily. And that's not to diminish what the gods are, but simply to recognize that that's one potential avenue for understanding how we ended up with something like personalities and statues and gods and goddesses and that sort of thing. So now let's look at human history. And I joke when I give this lecture and say that this is 200,000 years of human history in like an hour and a half. And of course we go really quickly in the beginning because we don't exactly have a lot of records and there's not as much to talk about. But when we're talking about speciation, I think it's important for us to think about what is it that makes a human human, and what are the distinguishing features with us cognitively and the way that we relate to the world that are different from what we get with the animals, and indeed different from what we have with our primate cousins. And so you'll notice that humans at a certain point in history started to make tools like hand axes, and they appeared to have maybe a ceremonial focus, some kind of aesthetic interest. These were things that were made that were too large to be useful. They were otherwise, people spent a lot of time with them or created them in a way that it's not just a chimpanzee creating something so that they can, go in and eat or whatever it might happen to be, single-use tools. These were tools that were created not even just to be tools. There's something else going on there. And I think this is where we have the first sparks, at least in the record, of something that is recognizably human, where we're obviously thinking a little bit more and doing different things with what was otherwise something that we had in common with the primates. Now, flash forward a bit, and then of course you have art and you have ceremonial burial. And ceremonial burial, I mean, we know that this was happening not only with grave goods and people who were buried with things that might have been important to them in that society, but also there's remnants of and chemical traces of flowers in certain circumstances. And so this is important, and this is often cited as being important, of course, because it relates to death. And one of the characteristics, and Joseph Campbell points this out as being something that is potentially very important in terms of a distinguishing feature between humans and other animals and anything else, is that we are aware not only of death, but of the inevitability of death. That death is something that we cannot get away from. That no matter how hard we try, no matter how well things go for us, it's going to happen. And the animals, arguably, of course, they're aware of death. They're aware that it can happen. They have to be keenly aware of this sort of thing. But they don't know that it is inevitable, that there's no getting around it whatsoever. And so you have this state where people want to get away from death, you want to avoid death, but then at the same time you also recognize, and maybe you're the only animal that recognizes, that you can't get away from it. What does that do psychologically? How do we come to grips with that? So that's one of the forces. Campbell points to that as a potential origin for religion. That's very interesting. Now, I would also point to the kind of singularity with respect to abstraction, that is the human capacity for cognition. And what I mean by this is that humans have a capacity not just for planning. I mean, obviously animals have this to some extent, and they can coordinate, and we see wolves hunt in packs and that kind of thing, and that's all well and good. But humans have a capacity for planning and communication that harkens to a kind of infinite potential with respect to abstraction, such that when we create a concept and we create a word for something, we can then take that word, become accustomed to it, internalize its use, so that we no longer have to consciously think about what the word means anymore, and then we can build upon that concept effortlessly. And this is because our conscious minds only have a certain really very limited capacity. I mean, phone numbers, that's about as long as you can go with something that is a random string of information before bits and pieces start falling off the table, some of us more so than others. I'm not particularly good with memory myself. And it's also the case with logical constructions. And so when you string, little clauses together in a sentence, you don't have to string too many of these together before it becomes very confusing to people. And a computer doesn't have this problem, right? I mean, nested parentheses, no problem. I mean, that's great. That's easy because it's very discrete and interpretable. It's very logical. The human mind just isn't in that way. And so what we do instead is we will learn something, and it doesn't have to be discretely. It doesn't have to be definitely. We're not getting to ground truth or facts or the laws of nature or anything of the kind. We just have something that we're comfortable with. And we relegate that to habit, and it passes below the line in terms of conscious interaction, and we can then build upon it. And then you take that piece and pass that into habit, and then you can do it again and again and again and again and again. I mean, this is human expertise. This is one way of understanding how it is that we build expertise, is by layering these abstractions. And there doesn't seem to be a limit to which we can layer these abstractions. And so when we talk about human intelligence, it's worth thinking that we represent a kind of singularity with respect to abstraction. We represent a kind of infinite potential, that there's no limit to how far we can go in building in just this way. And so this is really, really useful, not only in conceptualizing learning and understanding what's possible for human learning, but also in understanding what's unique about human beings. And Aristotle, of course, would go on to say that it was our capacity for reason. And so it's very similar to this, in saying that the sine qua non, the essential element of humanity, was reason. And that's a very philosophy-centric sort of approach. What I'm proposing is that there's another aspect that you may not have thought of, specifically with abstraction, that's interesting. Okay, now let's move on beyond ceremonial burial. Now, once we hit agriculture, we have a very interesting point in human history, because then we start to see larger societies. And there's something very different in terms of group dynamics between a small group where no one can really get away with being awful beyond a certain point. Like, you can only be so awful to a group before the group gangs up on you and, casts you out or kills you or does away with you in some way, in a small society. However, in a larger society, you end up with a construction a la something like Hobbes's Leviathan, where it is bigger than and is somehow the collective power of all of the people. And because it is bigger than all of the people, it remains bigger and can be the kind of strong arm of enforcing, of course, power structures and that sort of thing. Now, this is the Marxist legacy that we get, and it's very easy for us to think in those terms now. Now, what I want to point out in this line is not just what's changing politically and economically and socially, but also what changes mythologically at this time. Because hunter-gatherer cultures are those that, we have bear cults, and we have the cult of the, totemism, animism, and that kind of thing. And that kind of religion changes when we get agriculture. And all of a sudden, the important forces in the agricultural person's life become mythologized and take on divine qualities. And so we see a rice maiden, a corn maiden, like Persephone, that is buried and sent into the underworld for, a third of the year, so that the seed might then sprout and issue a kind of resurrection in the spring. And then that is celebrated, and she lives above the ground for a number of months until finally there is a harvest, and and so on and so on. And all of these things are marked by mythologically significant rituals and all of the trappings in terms of sacrifice and religion. And so that tends to be what we see in agricultural societies. Now let's move forward a little bit further. So we're going to see writing, for instance. So we get cities, and like what we get with, for instance, Göbekli Tepe and the others, and you start to see larger and larger organizations. Then we have writing, the development of writing around 3500 BC. 1500 years later, we finally start seeing religious writing. That's really important, I think, that we don't see writing of, in this case, I'm thinking of the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, but we don't see a lot of religious writing in the beginning, and indeed for a really, really long time. And that's significant, and it shows us how it is that religion was not something that you needed to write down. The worldview, the basis for how it is that they understood the world and the forces in their world, and it being full of gods, it was not necessary to write that down in the same way. Now, there may be a variety of reasons for that, and I don't necessarily want to go into the details, but suffice to say that's interesting, I think, and counterintuitive, and should give us pause. It should give us a reason to kind of doubt the perspective from which we're normally starting in thinking that we're transplanting ourselves into that society. We probably wouldn't make that kind of move. We would probably think to write down what was most important to us, but they didn't. So now, flash forward, and we have a really important series of events around 2000 BC. And this is where we have the development of significant mathematics and especially astronomy. And so what happens is, before this time, the mythology of traditional societies, of cities then, and then in ancient Sumer and Egypt and whatnot. So we have this very much eye-level view of things. So people were concerned with what they could see right in front of them. The bears were in front of me. Persephone and the various crops were in front of me. People were in front of me. And so there was a notion, of course, of the sky, and so you would have sky gods, but the emphasis was on what was in front of me at eye level. With astronomy, we have something different that happens. Now, bear in mind that the archetypes are what's important, right? So living in sacred time is what's important. Sacred time is characterized by what is eternal and unchanging. Well, most of the stuff that we see at eye level is very much temporal and changing. However, the stars, pretty constant from generation to generation. They move in extremely regular ways. And as far as they could tell, they were exactly the same. And so as it became possible for them to notice the motions of the stars, then they begin to record these things and say, oh, hey, here's the unchanging. This is where the order is. And for the ancient Greeks especially, I think this is salient. The ancient Greek cosmogony, so the origin story of how it is that the world was created. So you begin with chaos, and then out of chaos comes cosmos. Cosmos means order. And Zeus was in some way an ordering principle and an ordering god. And we'll get to Zeus in a moment because his name is just God. And anyway. So Zeus is a kind of ordering principle, and we're looking for order coming out of chaos. Well, the world then, the world of animals and things and lions and tigers and bears, that is a world of change. That is a world of, at least to some extent, disorder. Whereas the Empyrean realm of the stars, I mean, it seems to be eternal and unchanging. Okay, now we start hearing around this time, thou wilt be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we should mimic thereby, not just the Christian formulation of this, right? But what we get with Judaism, but also the divine court, the idea that the king's court here on earth should mirror the arrangement, the order of the heavens. And so the order of the heavens come down to the earth, and so bringing the stars down, and the order then being divine, and the king participating in this. And I think that all helps to make a certain amount of sense of what's going on there. So in other words, people's eyes moved from eye level here and gods and goddesses here to looking up at the stars and seeing the eternal order and the unchanging nature of what was going on there. So all of a sudden, the sky matters a lot more than it did before. So maybe it's not a surprise when 500 years later we start seeing monotheism in the form of Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, and then, of course, with Moses and the Hebrews also coming out of ancient Egypt. The Exodus was from Egypt. And indeed, Yahweh is considered a sky god. And so, if this is a sky god and Aten, the sun, is, I mean, you see the connection? We're talking about the most important of the elements of the sky, and the thought that, well, okay, that seems to be the ruling principle of the entire heavens. That's the Empyrean order of the eternal and the unchanging. Perhaps then it all owes to one thing. And so that's one possible interpretation of this in terms of how it is that then the divine becomes subsumed into a single deity. But we can do better than this, and here's what I have in mind. The major change, and this is the thing that I want to get across more than anything else when it comes to the transition from polytheism to monotheism, is that one of the principal things that we see, and this is, I haven't heard many people talk about this, is the move to interiority. That the interior life of the individual becomes increasingly important. This is the defining characteristic of what will come to be then at 1000 BC and beyond in the first millennium, the Axial Age. And so the Axial Age is characterized by magnificent changes in religion and culture. This is where we see the birth of philosophy, but it's also, by the way, at the same time where we see the birth of Buddhism, Upanishadic Hinduism, and Taoism with Lao Tzu in China. And so all across Eurasia, in the civilized world, we have this change, and the change is very similar in all of these different places, and it is a movement towards emphasizing increasing interiority. And so we see this especially with Hinduism, in the change from the Brahmanas, which were arguably just before this transition, to the Upanishads. And the Brahmanas are much more what is called orthopraxical. In other words, making sure that you have the right ladle and the right ritual setup and the right actions. And this is a lot of what we get in ancient Judaism as well, is it is an orthopraxical system that emphasizes action over individual belief and interior mental life. What we get after the transition, however, into the Upanishads, and then also with Thales and Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics in philosophy, with Buddhism in ancient India, and with Taoism in ancient China, is a move toward interiority, a move toward emphasizing the interiority and the interior mental life of the individual. And so that may be another reason why it is that we're talking about now God instead of gods, moving towards monotheism as the divine, as a great unity, insofar as our experience of the world is a great unity. That's another possibility. That's another avenue for trying to get into that particular space. Now, I should also say that there's an interesting kind of historical point here with especially the origins of monotheism with ancient Judaism. And so Freud actually wrote a book on this called Moses and Monotheism. And the thought was something like, well, you know, we typically hear that Moses, his name was taken from to draw from the water. And that sounds very reasonable because that's the story that we have of Moses, right? You know, floated down in a thatched basket and then picked up and hidden because, you know, we're worried about the influence this person is going to have, raised and going on to great things. That, by the way, is the story of Osiris. And people did not fail to notice this connection. In fact, this is an archetype, in a way, a story that we find in a lot of different places. And it just so happens that the specifics of that story with respect to being floated down the river and not just hidden and not just being, you know, destined for greatness, but also, you know, the actual basket and the pieces of the story. A lot of those elements are in common between the Hebrews and the ancient Egyptians. And so Freud, one of the things that he did was to say, okay, well, you know, Moses' name itself is interesting. And Freud actually claimed that he was Egyptian. And that his name, if you look at, for instance, Ramses, so the name Ramses, so Ramoses, Moses, son of, is what that particular portion of the word in Ramses' name means in ancient Egyptian. And so he is Ramses is the son of Ra. Well, maybe that means that Moses just has an Egyptian name that was later. I mean, this is one of the things that Freud did with this. And if you're interested in that, it's an interesting book. It's something that, of course, people now in the last couple hundred years or 100 years or so have found a lot of problems with, but nevertheless. So I think that's worth mentioning. Now, I want to build from Eliade here, and I want to move in the direction of Levi-strauss as well. So Claude Levi-strauss was another anthropologist in the 20th century who was famous for doing especially structural anthropology, so looking for invariant features of myths. And he has a work called Mythologique, which does a great deal of this. But the particular piece that I want to draw out here, or the particular two pieces, are bricolage and the idea of a total worldview. So bricolage is one way of understanding ancient polytheism. Bricolage and the bricoleur, this is the, handicraft and the artisan, the handicraftsman. And so this is someone who builds using the existing pieces. So they build new things, but they're only using the existing materials that they have on hand. And that's one way of understanding ancient polytheism, is that their world did not admit of novelty. It didn't allow for genuinely new things. It only allowed for the, assembling of pieces in new ways that were already there in one form or another. And so this dovetails into the idea of a total worldview, which he expounds in Myth and Meaning. And so the idea of a total worldview is one that does not admit of any gaps. So the thought is you either understand everything or you understand nothing. And this is one way of getting at what's going on with ancient polytheism, and why it is that everything is interpreted as a kind of existential threat, that they just can't make headway to try and bring in any sort of modern perspective in science and that sort of thing. This is one of the reasons that it is hard to do so, if indeed their worldview hangs together, where all of the pieces are connected together very tightly, and there is no novelty in the system, that everything is composed of the existing pieces, then it's going to be awfully hard to try to insert an idea and convince them that it is anything that is genuinely new. Everything tends to get assimilated into the system, and this is what we call syncretic mythologies. So these are mythologies that tend to interpret other systems as being just, he who you call Jupiter, we call Zeus. Okay, no big deal, And that's characteristic of those societies. It's, of course, not characteristic of those that are more concerned with linear history, which is largely the inheritance that we have in the modern Western world. Now, linear history, we start seeing the first echoes of this in ancient Egypt, with especially ancient Judaism. And so the idea that there is going to be a Messiah figure is one that points to a particular, turning point in history, a particular time, a particular event. And then, of course, later with Christianity, the historicity of Christ and that particular event becomes important in a way that is just not analogous to anything in polytheism. Because in polytheism, the emphasis is on the eternal, not the individual historical events. As a matter of fact, that's precisely what you don't want to emphasize. And so it very much turns polytheism on its head. And I think, like I said, the best way of getting to this is by thinking of it as a move from a completely external and exterior consciousness, a way of living that doesn't recognize as much of a boundary between self and other, between self and world, moving towards one of interiority, where the inside of an individual matters and what's going on the inside matters. And indeed, this is what we see at the beginning of philosophical history, especially by the time of Pythagoras. So with Homer, the shades that roam the underworld were not fully developed people. They're not souls in the same way that we typically think of a full soul of, rich with personality. These were not the bearers of moral qualities. We don't get souls that have moral qualities until we reach the time of Pythagoras. And we can see the transition here with the way that Helen was treated. And so Helen of Troy, the idea is that she is overcome with desire and overcome with love and cannot help herself. In other words, being possessed by a god. And by the time we get to Gorgias, who is one of the sophists that Plato has a dialogue about and talks to, has Socrates talk to in one of his dialogues. By the time we get to Gorgias, Gorgias wrote an encomium for Helen. And in the encomium for Helen, he describes Helen as more of a bearer of moral qualities, and he does so by way of almost a kind of satire. And so by this time, we can conceive of a soul as having moral qualities, and those stories about the gods seem proportionally outrageous. And the idea that someone could do this without being culpable and, that's a new thing. And by Plato's time, we get this, which is why I think with the pre-Socratics, and especially by the time we get to Plato and his discussion of the poets in the Republic, philosophers tend to oppose many aspects of religion and look to change it, look to or to preserve that which is worthy and to get rid of the stories that are obviously immoral. In other words, they want to correct religion to make it in line with the new worldview. And so that's an indication more than anything else that things have changed and the way that people see the world had changed by that time. And so I think that also helps us to try and understand what's going on, because I argue, and I like to throw out there as a provocative idea, that Plato is the last great polytheist, that his forms, being like the gods and perhaps being the vestiges of the gods, are under the umbrella of the greatest of the forms, which is the good. The good is what was likened to, not coincidentally, God in the early centuries in Christianity. The early centuries in Christianity were very much influenced by Platonism and drew from Plato and the hierarchy, the great chain of being that Plato described with the forms. And so the good and all of the other forms were the children of the good, just as we hear children of God in Christianity. That language is already in Plato. And so I think that may also give us a window into understanding what's going on there. I hope this helps. I want to leave you with a couple of stories from Joseph Campbell, who I think is really good in this regard in trying to get into that kind of headspace, enter into that sort of imaginative horizon. And I have in mind the first one that he took from Lucien Levy-Bruhl, which is the story of Kivavia, the hunter. And we're told that a anthropologist was with this person in a traditional society who was going hunting. And he said, I am Kivavia. And not I am like Kivavia, or I'm going to take on the personality of Kivavia, but I am Kivavia. And the question came then, oh, well, don't you mean you are like Kivavia, or you're going to be, like this person? No, I am Kivavia. And that's one of the ways of understanding the difference between an ancient polytheist take on divine possession and how it is that identity is very fluid and one can become the god in that circumstance, and the way that we typically think about it. As if to say, oh, well, you can't be serious that you are the god. As if to say those two things are incompatible. And that, I think, is perhaps the best and most iconic of stories with respect to trying to get us into this. Now, the second of which is that Campbell was fond of saying that, someone would ask, I want to have a relationship with God. I want to have an experience of God. I don't understand how it is that, we're supposed to do this. And Campbell said, well, I just came back from India and people aren't having that problem. They experience God all the time. You just walk outside and there you go. And that is, I think, another kind of hard-hitting difference in terms of the perspective, that it's not this rational thing. It's not something that we have to think about or believe or have faith in or anything of the kind. It's very much a in-your-face, this is how I see the world. Here it is. There is my experience. Before I ever have a chance to think about it, that is my experience. Here is the divine. Thunderstorm, Zeus. I don't have to make that connection. It's simply there. And that, I think, may give us, hopefully, the most useful way of entering into one possible history and one possible understanding of ancient polytheism, and how it is that set us up for the earliest philosophy. I hope it helps.